The winter of 1897 proved the most severe anyone could recall in the Dakota region. Snow descended in dense, unyielding sheets for weeks, and the earth hardened so deeply that even the sturdiest men found it tough to pierce with pickaxe or spade. It was in this frigid season that Henry Coleman faced the hardest task of his 43 years. Henry had toiled as a farmer his entire adult life, tending the same unyielding prairie plot his father had staked out decades before. The land yielded well when rains arrived, but those rains had grown scarce in recent years. His wife, Ellen, had died the prior spring, leaving him alone with debts that seemed to sprout like weeds in a neglected field. The bank had already seized most of his animals, and the farm itself would likely be lost before the next planting season arrived. So, when Dr. Matthews approached him that bleak February morning with an odd proposal, Henry listened despite the uneasy twist in his gut. "I know this isn't the sort of task you're used to, Henry," the elderly doctor said, adjusting his wire-framed glasses as they stood in the general store, "but I'm in a tough spot, and you're one of the few I trust with something this sensitive." Henry shifted his weight from one worn boot to another, waiting for the doctor to go on. "A young woman arrived in town yesterday with a passing family. They found her collapsed on the road about 10 miles south of here. By the time they got her to me, she was—" Dr. Matthews paused, choosing his words with care. "Well, she seemed to have passed away. No pulse I could find, no breath I could see, cold as the winter itself." The doctor removed his hat and ran his fingers through his thinning silver hair. "The family couldn't stay. They had their own troubles and a long trip ahead. They left some coins for her burial, but the ground's too frozen for the usual gravedigger. His arthritis, as him laid up something awful." Henry understood now why he'd been approached. His years of farming had given him strong arms and hands skilled at working tough soil, but something about the situation felt off. "Doc," he said slowly, "if she's been gone since yesterday, why not wait for the ground to thaw come spring?" Dr. Matthews looked uneasy. "That's just it, Henry. Something doesn't feel right about this whole affair. The family that brought her seemed anxious, eager to move on, and the girl, she doesn't look like someone who died naturally. No signs of sickness or injury I can see, just still." Henry studied the doctor's lined face. Dr. Matthews had delivered half the children in the county and cared for the ill and dying for over 20 years. If something seemed wrong to him, it likely was. "I need the work," Henry admitted quietly. "The pay will help, and I reckon I can handle the digging better than most in this weather." "I thought you might," Dr. Matthews said with clear relief. "But Henry, if anything seems odd, anything at all, you come find me right away. Promise me that." Henry nodded, though he wasn't sure what could be strange about a burial already so peculiar. The doctor led him to a small room behind his office, where the young woman lay on a plain wooden table, covered with a clean white sheet. When Dr. Matthews pulled back the cloth, Henry drew a sharp breath. She was stunning, in a way that stirred thoughts of poetry he'd never learned to pen. Her golden hair fanned across the pillow like spun straw, and her face held a calm expression that seemed almost too peaceful for someone who'd supposedly died on a frozen road. Her skin, though pale, had a quality Henry couldn't quite define. She looked more like someone in a deep slumber than someone who'd left this world. "How old would you say she is?" Henry asked softly. "Hard to say for sure. Maybe 25, man. Maybe 30. No identification, no belongings except the clothes she wore." Dr. Matthews covered her again with the sheet. "The family said they didn't know her name." Henry spent the rest of that morning preparing for the burial. He chose a tranquil spot in the small cemetery just outside town, under an old oak tree that would offer shade when warmer months returned. The ground was indeed frozen solid, but Henry had learned patience from years of coaxing life from stubborn land. He built a small fire nearby and worked slowly, letting the heat soften the earth bit by bit. By late afternoon, he dug down about 2 feet. It was slow, grueling work, and his hands were numb despite his thick gloves. The snow kept falling in gentle flakes, and the short winter day was already fading into evening. Henry returned to Dr. Matthews' office to collect the young woman. Together they wrapped her carefully in a simple pine coffin the doctor had bought from the local carpenter. As they carried her through the quiet streets, Henry found himself thinking of Ellen, of how different this burial felt from the painful day he'd laid his wife to rest. At the gravesite, Henry lowered the coffin gently into the partially dug grave. It would have to do for now. He could finish digging in the morning and complete the burial properly. But something made him pause before shoveling the first load of earth. Perhaps it was the way the lamplight danced across the coffin lid, or maybe it was the strange feeling he'd carried all day that something wasn't right. Whatever the reason, Henry found himself kneeling beside the grave and carefully opening the coffin one last time. The young woman lay exactly as they'd placed her, hands folded peacefully across her chest. But as Henry looked closer, something made him catch his breath. Was it his imagination, or did her skin seem to have more color than it had that morning? He leaned closer, and that's when he saw it, the slightest flutter beneath her eyelids, as if she were dreaming. Henry stared in astonishment, hardly daring to breathe. Then, as he watched, her eyes slowly opened. They were the most striking blue eyes he'd ever seen, and they looked directly at him with a mix of confusion and gratitude that made his heart skip several beats. "Where?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the cold air. "Where am I?" Henry sat back on his heels, his mind racing. "You're safe," he said gently, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "You're in Millbrook. Do you remember what happened to you?" She tried to sit up, and Henry quickly helped her, wrapping his heavy coat around her shoulders. She was shivering now, which seemed like a good sign. "I remember falling," she said slowly. "The cold. Someone saying I was—" She trailed off, looking around at the cemetery, at the open grave, and understanding dawned in her eyes. "Oh my goodness, were you about to bury me?" Henry finished quietly. "Yes, ma'am, though I'm mighty glad you decided to wake up first." Despite everything, she smiled, a smile that seemed to warm the chilly winter air around them. "I'm Clara," she said, "Clara Bennett. I don't suppose you know how I ended up here?" Henry helped her to her feet, noting that she seemed steady enough, though still confused. "A traveling family brought you to our doctor yesterday. They said they found you on the road. Everyone thought you had—" He paused, unsure how to finish delicately. "Died," Clara said simply. "I remember feeling so cold, so tired. I must have fallen asleep in the snow." She looked at Henry with eyes full of wonder. "You saved my life. If you'd buried me without looking—" The thought sent a chill through Henry that had nothing to do with the winter weather. "Don't think about that," he said firmly. "What matters is you're alive and safe." They walked slowly back toward town, Henry carrying his lantern and Clara wrapped in his coat. Along the way, she told him what soon he could recall. She'd been traveling alone to meet a distant relative in the next territory when her horse threw her during a sudden blizzard. She must have wandered in the snow for hours before collapsing. "I have nowhere to go now," she admitted as they reached the outskirts of Millbrook. "No horse, no supplies, and my relative is probably wondering what became of me." Henry found himself making an offer before he'd fully thought it through. "You could stay at my place until you regain your strength and figure out your next steps. It's not much, but it's warm and I could use the company." Clara stopped walking and looked at him with surprise. "You don't even know me. For all you know, I could be—" "A decent person who's had some bad luck," Henry interrupted gently. "Same as most of us, I reckon." Over the following days, Clara proved to be exactly that. She was bright, kind, and had a way of bringing warmth into Henry's quiet farmhouse that he hadn't felt since Ellen's passing. She insisted on helping with cooking and cleaning, despite his protests, and in the evenings they'd sit by the fire and share stories of their lives. Clara had been a schoolteacher before heading west. She loved books and learning, and had a gift for explaining complex ideas simply. Henry found himself sharing things he hadn't told anyone: his struggles with the farm, his loneliness since Ellen's death, and his fears of losing everything he'd worked for. "You know," Clara said one evening as they watched the snow fall outside the kitchen window, "I've been thinking about what happened, about how I ended up in that grave." Henry looked up from his coffee. "What about it?" "I think maybe it was meant to happen just as it did. Not the almost dying part, but finding my way here, to you." She smiled that warming smile of hers. I believe sometimes the worst moments in our lives are gateways to the best ones. As winter slowly turned to spring, Henry and Clara found something neither had sought, but both deeply needed. She helped him find ways to farm that made better use of his land. He gave her the stability and companionship she'd always hoped to find. On a warm April morning, as they worked together in the garden behind his farmhouse, Henry looked up to see Clara laughing at one of his chickens. The sight filled him with a peace he thought he'd lost forever. Clara, he said, setting down his hoe, I have something to ask you. She turned to him, dirt on her hands and joy in her eyes. What is it, Henry? Would you consider staying here permanently, not as someone I'm helping, but as my wife? Clara's smile was brighter than the spring sunshine. Henry Coleman, she said, I thought you'd never ask. They were married that June in the little church where Henry had once said goodbye to Ellen. The same cemetery where he'd almost buried Clara now held flowers they'd planted together, and the oak tree provided shade for their wedding reception. Years later, when people asked Henry about the day he met his wife, he'd pause, a thoughtful look in his eyes. I was hired to bury her, he'd say, watching Clara tend their children in the garden they'd planted together. But she had other plans entirely. Best thing that ever happened to me was taking a job I never wanted. And Clara would smile and add, sometimes life has to halt completely before it can start anew in ways we never dreamed. Their farmhouse became known throughout the county as a place where travelers could find a warm meal and a safe place to rest. Henry and Clara never turned anyone away, perhaps because they both knew what it felt like to need the kindness of strangers. The farm thrived under their shared care, and they raised 4 children who grew up knowing that the most important things in life often come disguised as the scariest moments. On quiet winter evenings, when the snow fell thick and serene outside their windows, Henry and Clara would sit by the fire and marvel at the mysterious ways love finds us when we're brave enough to keep our hearts open, even in the darkest times.